There's a political row growing over the O'Farrell government's plan to privatise the Kurnell desalination plant. The opposition suspects the government's planning to keep the desal plant in almost continuous operation over the next 25 years under a private lease arrangement in return for more than $2 billion in upfront payments. They say consumers will have to pay even more for their water. The desal plant was only ever meant to be a security backup for drinking water in the event of another deep drought. While the O'Farrell government denies it will burden consumers with extra costs through privatisation, it appears the trick was already in the trigger.
After 16 years of underinvestment by Labor in infrastructure, the O'Farrell government is determined to, as quickly as we can, build infrastructure that's required in this state.
The state needs infrastructure investment, and the O'Farrell government romped into office on that promise. Finance Minister Greg Pearce is hoping to raise more than $2 billion by leasing the output of the desalination plant over 25 years to private investors like superannuation funds.
Entering into a long-term lease of the desalination plant, not affecting the supply or cost of the water, you can unlock hundreds of millions of dollars that can then be invested in providing the infrastructure, the roads, the rail, the ports that this state needs.
Listen carefully. Not affecting the supply or cost of the water, the Premier said. That commitment's now being questioned by two former senior government ministers.
I have an objection on principle to leasing back the plant because Sydney Water is a natural monopoly and natural monopolies should stay in the hands of government.
Warragamba Dam is currently at nearly 80% capacity, yet the desal plant over at Kurnell is still running at near capacity in its 2-year warranty period. In 2007, under the Yemmer government, desal was a hot political issue. Barry O'Farrell and the coalition opposed its construction, as did most of the people of New South Wales, according to polls at the time. Even as a deep drought gripped the state, popular opinion was against it. But it was built at Kurnell and began turning seawater through reverse osmosis into potable or drinking water from January 2010, with an output of 250 megalitres per day. There are enough pipes, membranes and pumps capable of ramping up to 500 megalitres per day. Total cost $1.896 billion. The desal plant is operated by Veolia Water and is a wholly owned subsidiary of state-owned Sydney Water. In a separate deal, which also impacts on its water price, power for the desal plant is exclusively contracted from the Bungendore Capital Wind Farm. In the future, it's meant to be switched on if catchment levels fall below 70% and switched off when they reach 80%. This is known as the 70-80 trigger.
Well, in simple terms, you don't want to be running the desalination plant when Warragamba Dam is overflowing. So you avoid that by saying when a dam hits a particular level on the downturn, that's when we turn on the desalination plant to augment Sydney's supply. And that figure is 70%, and that was arrived at independently by the hydrologists and the other experts in order that the water level and the water supply for Sydney remained at or about 50% over the long term.
Former Premier Nathan Rees was the Minister for Water when the Cabinet, against popular opinion, took the plunge into desal after the 2007 state election.
It's purely arithmetic, how you arrive at this.
Scientist Lee Martin from the Total Environment Centre says Mr Rees's trigger was arbitrary and too high for what was meant to be a water security facility.
The 70% trigger is highly questionable. 70% supply levels in Warragamba and the other dams is not drought conditions. Certainly 30% is drought conditions and approaching emergency conditions. It would be far more logical to operate the expensive desalination plant and to deal with the environmental costs attached with disposal of the concentrated brine byproducts only in emergency drought situations.
On the 2nd of May this year, Finance Minister Greg Pearce, by letter, instructed the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal to determine a fair price for desal water after he declared it to be a monopoly supplier under the Water Industry Competition Act. Under pricing principles, there was this final criterion, which critics have seized on as the O'Farrell government's agenda to guarantee a cash flow for any future private lessee.
Sydney Desalination Plant is to be entitled to charge for providing the water supply services irrespective of the levels of water in dam storages servicing Sydney or availability of water from other sources.
It's disturbing because it implies that the desalination plant will operate far more than is actually required.
Shadow Treasurer Michael Daly and Nathan Rees say that desal privatisation could permanently inbuild a higher price for Sydney water.
This is akin, Quentin, to paying for water if you don't even turn the tap on. It's a rip-off, a blatant rip-off, fattening the pig for market day, trying to artificially inflate the value of the desal plant so Barry O'Farrell and his government can flog it off. And the customers, Sydney Water customers, families in Sydney will pay for that rip-off.
I can categorically say to you and to the people of New South Wales, there will be no extra charges as a result of this transaction.
I think the crucial thing is that if the plant is privatised, the current operating rules should not be locked into the contracts.
But it will be locked in, according to Minister Pearce. The O'Farrell government will not change the 70-80 trigger. And that's the rub for consumers, drought or no drought. What about the environmental concern that the trigger at 70% is too high and that a trigger of 30 to 40% in deep drought conditions would be more appropriate? It is very expensive water.
I agree with you on that. But look, this debate really was had several years ago. We don't want to reopen that. We want to get on with the transaction. We want to get on with freeing up that cash so that we can invest in much-needed infrastructure.
What started as a desalination plant the public did not support will emerge as the one we've got and must pay for through our water bills for the next quarter century and beyond. So, close your eyes, pay your water bills and think infrastructure.